Hello, everyone, and welcome back down here to the Gamer's Den. With me, your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. We are keeping on with the DM Guide series here, taking a look at war settings. Today, we are specifically going to be discussing who it is that's leading the war effort. Now, to start off with, when you think of that, it seems like the easy answer is go with the generals. The generals are the ones leading, or the the commanders, the field marshals, any number of different ranks. And honestly, if you're thinking of that many different ranks for the overall person in charge of the grand military campaign and laying out the strategies, then hey, fantastic. Variety is the spice of life, and coming up with other rank names aside from just your plain old, well, general is fantastic. Absolutely a wonderful thing to do. It helps to differentiate things real nice when you do that. But there's other things to consider when you're thinking about who it is that's leading the overall war effort. As generals absolutely are integral to the overall war effort. Well, in theory they are. In theory they are integral to the overall war effort. Ideally, they should be capable enough, intelligent enough, and experienced enough to be able to lay out strategies, try to anticipate what their enemy's movements will be, identify strategic locations, either to defend, attack, or just outright avoid or somehow isolate. They should be able to do these things pretty reliably without a gross expenditure of troops, as although we are talking about human lives and from a moral standpoint, losing a human life, especially to something so tragic as violence, is an unfortunate failing and an unfortunate evil when it comes to war. It is still a resource to be expended in a wartime setting. So that's something. Resources are not something to be just wasted or thrown away uselessly. But not all generals, not all field marshals, not all commanders are created equally. Some could give a damn about the lives of their troops. There are just so many chickens waiting to be cooked, and having that kind of personality fleshed out and thought about ahead of time will do a lot to inform the overall what the overall war effort looks like. Because I'll take Warhammer 40k for example. There in the Imperium, the Imperium of mankind, there are untold billions upon billions, even trillions of human lives in existence. What is the life of one human being when weighed against the continued existence of the entire species? What's the weight of 1,000 lives, 10,000, 100,000, even 1,000,000 lives? These lives in the Imperial Guard are meant to be thrown in waves at the enemy, or stacked up in waves, forming a living wall of trenches and las guns, shooting off their fire down the lines at the oncoming enemy, whether it be orcs, traitors, heretics, cultists, necrons, or even the foul denizens and servants of chaos. These people are meant to have their lives expended and extinguished en masse for the glory of the Empire and for the sake of their Emperor who sits upon the golden throne on Terra. But even then, you still find commanders that are careful in how they expend these lives and how they make use of these lives. And typically, although it's rare to find that amongst the generals, because the generals have to take a look at the broad overarching view of the battlefields, of the war effort, of the overall objectives, and the what it's going to take to complete these objectives. Worrying about the individual lives of soldiers is not necessarily their concern. The overall composition, strength, and well-being of different battalions, regiments, or army groups, that certainly is something within their purview, but that the responsibility of seeing to the smaller units, the smaller day-to-day details, that works down the overall chain of command, and that's the next important step here, is that chain of command. Because a general will have various colonels underneath of them. They will have different other different differentiating ranks beneath them, different majors, captains, lieutenants, sergeants, working on and on down, dealing with smaller and smaller and smaller unit scales. Very likely a sergeant is certainly going to be more concerned about the well-being of the men underneath their command, and a lieutenant will likely be more concerned about that as well. Even a captain could, but as you get progressively up higher and higher in the ranks, the wider and wider and more broad the focus has to be for those commanders. But even then, you can still create some differentiation in these various officer roles, these various officer characters that you may have populating your wartime setting by giving them a little bit of a different personality. Continuing on with the Warhammer 40k example, one of my favorites is Colonel Commissar Abram Gaunt, leader of Gaunt's Ghosts. Absolutely a fantastic story, wonderful book series. I wholeheartedly recommend you pick this up at your earliest convenience if you haven't read it already. And if you're a fan of Warhammer 40k, it offers a refreshing change of perspective. Certainly you get plenty of that classical sense of the endless numbers of billions of lives within the hammer of the Emperor, the Imperial Guard, being just infinitely expendable and infinitely replaceable. But Colonel Gaunt takes a look at his troopers, the soldiers from Tanith, and he views them as incredibly precious. He does not squander the lives of his soldiers uselessly. He tries to make sure that if any of them are going to die, it's at least for a cause and objective that is of actual importance. Or he still accepts the deaths of his soldiers as an inevitability of war, but each one hangs on him, especially if they're any of the soldiers that have actually gotten close to them as he's led them over the many long years of their campaign in the Sabbat World's Crusade. So it's a refreshing change. It's a refreshing difference of perspective, and it serves to make him so wholly unique and distinct from his contemporaries, especially considering he's a commissar within the Warhammer 40k universe. For those of you that may not know, although I'm not going to get into the details here because there is so much we could unload from this, but the commissars are assigned to individual units. They're typically not in charge, although they can take control if necessary, but they're there to enforce morale. Usually being there to enforce morale means they are going to do their damnedest to be scarier than whatever it is that's charging at their guardsmen. Meaning any guardsmen, they try to keep the morale up, but if any of them starts to falter or run away, they are well within their rights and frequently start shooting and executing soldiers as a method of keeping the rest in line. They're either going to face death at the enemy or death at the hands of the commissar, and death at the enemy is much more preferable and honorable than having death dispensed to you at the hands of your commissar. Hell, commissars are even authorized to execute officers for failing in their duty, and that's typically when they will seize control, either when the officer has died, either at the hands of the enemy or at the hands of the commissar. So, as you can imagine, pretty goddamn brutal setting. But story for another time, lore dives for another time, hopefully. But again, like I said, that serves to make the Colonel Commissar Abram Gaunt of the Tanith First and Only very distinct from his contemporaries, both in the commissariat and the various other officers and generals within the Imperial Guard. And you can absolutely very easily do this within your own campaign by just thinking a little bit about the personalities of the men, women, or whatever may be in between or non-existent at all, that may be leading soldiers, what their personalities are or what their tactical outlook is, because you may have some instances where an officer does not have a personality. Think about Star Wars: The Clone Wars, particularly their animated series. The Separatists use droids extensively throughout their forces. It's almost entirely it is entirely a droid army with a few select exceptions, and they use highly intelligent, well-programmed, well-maintained data droids as tactical commanders. These droids, they have no real personality to speak of, But you have to consider that they're probably programmed for a variety of different tactical roles. One that's commanding forces out in the depths of space, commanding a fleet of ships, is going to have fundamentally different programming and focuses and emphasis on ship-to-ship space combat, whereas one that's programmed for ground fighting is going to be more knowledgeable about ground unit tactics, the different forms of weaponry, artillery that can be brought to bear, how to deploy different tanks and formation with their infantry. So, again, even with an a non-living creature, you can serve to still make the different officers feel a bit more distinct and varied than you might initially expect you'd be able to. And so, but it's not just officers that we have to think about here. I mentioned the commissariat before. They're not necessarily within the officer command structure, although they are able to take command, and it's rare, but as with Colonel Commissar Ibn Magant, sometimes they are given a command within the Imperial Guard. But we also have to think about outside of it, because, well, think about our own governmental system. It's not the various generals that are overall in charge of the army. It's the elected leader of our nation that's in charge. The person that occupies and inhabits the Oval Office, the President of the United States. That person is the overall commander-in-chief of the armed forces. Now, they can't unilaterally declare war. Congress has to approve it and vote along with it, but other than that, the president gives their go-ahead on quite a number of different operations. And that's something else to consider too, is the type of government that is employing this military to go to war. Now, the military and the government may be the exact same thing. If you're going for an extreme militaristic, hardline, fascist-styled sort of government, that is absolutely something that you can do. And makes for a great series of villains, or if somehow you've made them the protagonists, like with Warhammer 40k, you can certainly do that and make for an interesting and very fun and engaging and very different setting for your players. But there are so many other different combinations that you can throw out there, and it really just depends on the setting. You can go with a magocratic autocracy where mages, wizards, people that are able to cast arcane spells are the ones who overall rule, and, well, mages being in charge of a city or a government just in terms of sheer raw power certainly makes sense. Not only that, given that powerful mages also have to be incredibly intelligent as well, you could start to make an argument for mages ruling and governing a city or even a nation, especially if they're operating in some sort of a council. But powerful people are more likely to amass more power and use that power to strengthen their power bases and further build more power. It escalates and builds on and on. Not only that, but powerful mages could easily become incredibly wealthy, hence the autocrat thing thrown in there too. All the power and wealth. Sometimes there's enough to make both of those terms interchangeable, but you get the idea. There are so many different ways you can customize different governments, and how extensive you want to get is, of course, entirely up to you. To a certain extent, there can be such a thing as too much detail, especially if you're just dumping all of this in front of your players and giving them in-depth, intricate little explanations. That's not necessary, but doing just enough to where, you understand it's a republic-styled system where there are elected leaders put into place, and then they run the country, and the number of votes to actually elect the leaders is actually rather limited, rather than having a popular vote. As you take a look at ancient Greece, they were a republic-styled system as well. Certainly there are democratic methods to them, because they did vote and elect a number of their leaders, but the number of people that actually had the rights to vote on any issues of state were relatively minimal, and they still had a large number of slaves. Even in the U.S., before the Civil War, the U.S. was definitely a democratic republic-styled system, but we maintained a great number of slaves, unfortunately, for too much of our nation's history. But that's a whole other debate for another time. Point being, it is important. It's most important, especially, to consider who it is that's leading the army, the armed forces, and why who's leading them to war, and what kind of governmental system is in place. Knowing what kind of a governmental system is in place, plus the personalities and people that are commanding the overall forces, can do a lot to help inform how things are structured, what state the morale of the armed forces is in, and what kind of tactics are employed. Now, tactics and strategy will, of course, vary depending on what exactly the situation is, which all of that is up to you to create, but it goes a long way towards helping with all of that. Now, with that said, we're going to go ahead and leave it there. I hope you've enjoyed today's video. I've certainly enjoyed putting it together and bringing it here to you. And if you did like it, why not show your interest and your enjoyment by clicking the like button down there at the bottom. And hell, if you've been enjoying the content overall here so far, consider subscribing to the channel. We can always use more members and alumni down here at the Gamers Den. But with that said, I've been your host, Jordan, your master of lore and storyteller extraordinaire. You guys have yourselves a good night. Can't find my mouse.